This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Gupta. I'm absolutely delighted that John Klein has joined me from near DC in America today. Ms. Klein is an expert on space warfare, and he wrote a noted book on this subject last year, which is the reason I invited him to have this conversation. India is also really buffering up its own assets, as it were, in the space warfare domain, and it's a perfect time to talk to Mr. Klein about this entire domain, how it's shaping up, what's happening to the competition in this domain, and all these issues. Thanks very much, John.
Happy to be here. Thanks. I appreciate your listeners for listening to this podcast.
I want to begin by asking you, when you look at the domain of space as a vital theater of war in the future, some would say it's already becoming perhaps a little bit even in the present, not just in the future. So when you look at that, this domain, talk to me a little bit about, let's begin with a broad overview. What are you seeing? How's the competition shaping up?
Okay, so your importance of your question is like the historical context. So when we look at the beginning of the space age, it has been militarized since the beginning. So there's a difference between militarization of space and then the weaponization of space. So, back in the 1950s, with the launch of Sputnik, with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, we used satellites for treaty verification, Earth observation, just to kind of monitor what's going on, and then for satellite communications and the like. So the recent concern is more about, the weaponization of space. Weaponization of space is really nothing new either. Both the Soviet Union and the U.S. did a direct descent hit-to-kill ASAT test back in the 80s. We've had China do a ASAT test. India's done an ASAT test. So, this idea of weapons and weapons use in space is growing. But it's not just the kinetic stuff. So I'll bring out my prop here. But we have, this would be like a direct descent hit-to-kill ASAT against a satellite. But we also have electromagnetic spectrum here. So it's jamming, lasing. This is my laser pointer here against my optical sensor. Jamming and lasing of satellites is going on a daily basis. Also in the war in Ukraine, we're seeing the jamming of geoposition satellite, position navigation timing signals too. So it's kind of a concern, when we consider the direct descent hit-to-kill ASATs that countries have done, it causes a lot of debris. And that debris or residual effect stays up in orbit for decades, potentially centuries. But as you mentioned, U.S., Russia, China, other countries, India are interested in using space for national security, border protection, knowing who's coming across the borders and the like. So the idea of competition and potential militarization or weapons in space is only growing.
Of course, we saw some of the use of satellites even in their sort of crowdsourced gathering of information, which what we call OSINT today. And it's high on my mind because, of course, only a few months ago when India and Pakistan had a conflict, we saw the role of OSINT. Now, some, of course, were actually people trying to perhaps give wrong information, but a lot of real-time good information was also coming using the analysis of satellite imagery and so on and so forth. Now, of course, what you're talking about is going further, obviously, to the real weaponization of space. And in this, let's begin by talking about the my apologies, the America-China story. Once again, this is perhaps the fulcrum around which the story is built. India's coming up, but we should still begin with America and China. What's going on there?
So on the, I would say both countries are looking to use space more. China has a different culture, history, so its incorporation of space is more for concern with the informationized use of space. Comprehensive national power is how a lot of the People's Liberation Army documents translate. So space isn't for space sake, it's how it feeds into information to achieve the objectives of the party. The U.S. has a different approach. It kind of considers space as an enabler for the other operational domains. But you mentioned, even India's role. We use satellites, again, the Earth observation, the OSINT, but it's also synthetic aperture radar. It's electromagnetic warfare type of electronic emissions detection and the like. And now we have the role of potentially AI and how it fuses this data. So, there's open source reporting on what China and Russia have been doing. China has some capabilities with their SJ satellite series with maneuverability, concerns over rendezvous and proximity. So this is when two space systems get close to each other. Can they inspect and the like? So there's a lot of interest in the geostationary belt. So that's an orbit where as the Earth rotates, the satellite kind of stays with it, fixed over a location. We have thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit. We have Planet Labs, or excuse me, the commercial company Planet, which again does Earth observation, just change detection on the Earth every day. So we're seeing the increase the use of commercial, especially on the US, Europe, and I would say this would be an area where India could potentially see a lot of growth also.
One of the terminologies that has emerged from this competition that you're talking about is something called space deterrence. Now, many people still don't entirely understand space being space. If you cannot, in a sense, boundaryify space, how do you build deterrence? It would be great if you talk us through what space deterrence really means.
Okay. It's really, it reminds me of a saying of Karl von Clausewitz, which was a Prussian strategic thinker.
Yes.
He would say, everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. And the same thing holds for deterrence. So folks like me, when we write our books, which you mentioned, we talk about deterrence. It's just about affecting the decision calculus of others. It's a very simple concept. It can be used for positive for the allies. U.S. would have tried to assure its allies, hey, we want to control a potential arms race in space. Let's work for a common goal to minimize debris. But it's also about dissuading potential conflict. Or if conflict is actually underway, maybe it's compelling the acquiescence to seek a peaceful solution. So what is space deterrence? Some people say it's just deterrence, okay? We like, again, to say something is this or that in the U.S. or the West, but can these satellites, by their capabilities, known or implied, can it affect the decision calculus of would-be rivals? So if I have so much capability, thousands and thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit, maybe I am deterring you or dissuading you from attacking one of these satellites when I have 9,000 other satellites that can still pick up the function. So I'm conveying the futility of escalating or having a conflict extend into space. Or maybe it's these Earth observation, this OSINT that you talked about. Maybe I'm able to see the India-Pakistan border. So maybe I'm dissuading would-be forces from going across a border. You're going to be detected. There's no way you're going to succeed. So, there's a role for space assets in affecting the decision calculus of others for a positive or negative aim. That's all it is. It's really a simple idea.
Also, other kinds of terminologies that are emerging, John. There is talk of something called bodyguard satellites and space situational awareness. Now, talk to us a little bit about these systems and how they are being thought of and indeed deployed, especially in the America-China scenario.
Okay, so you mentioned space situational awareness. It's also the militaries might refer to it as space domain awareness, similar to maritime domain awareness, which all navies do. Even India's a wonderful navy and needs to know what's happening in a domain. For space, we want to know what's happening in the domain, both for ourselves, or for would-be aggressors. So this can go back to satellites that may be inspecting other satellites on orbit. They may be using radio frequency detection, optical sensors, range finding, and other sources to know who's moving around and where. A lot of that is tracking of satellites in orbit, whether their orbitology, where they're going, where they're expected to going. These can be terrestrial-based, Earth-based sensors, optical telescopes, radio telescopes and the like, just to kind of track, because there's thousands and thousands of satellites on orbit in all orbital regimes. You bring up bodyguard satellites. So this idea of, hey, if I have a very high-end, exquisite satellite that's used for Earth observation and I want to keep it, maybe I need to have some type of capability to protect it. So I need to maybe maneuver around it. If a would-be aggressor tries to interfere with it, maybe I take measures to self-protect. This idea is what we do in the other domains. You could say it's what law enforcement does, policing functions. If I have something of value, I want to make sure, hey, maybe it's just somebody that doesn't know what they're doing, but I'm going to keep them at arm's length or away so my exquisite satellite can still operate. We don't need to take things out kinetically. Maybe it's just jamming, lasing, some type of non-kinetic means to make sure my high-end satellite is protected.
Talking about the relevance and in a sense the potency of kinetic kill technology compared to emerging non-kinetic ASAT options like cyber and electronic warfare, how do you see this entire scenario panning out?
So overall, I think the non-kinetic technology has more promise. So, back to the history lesson which I gave, the technology for a direct descent hit to kill ASAT that causes large amount of debris, that's been around for almost 40, 50 years. So it's pretty well established. But the U.S. Secretary of Defense a few years back put out the tenets of responsible behavior. We know that the generation of large amount of debris is bad for everybody. It's bad for friendly countries and against aggressors. So if I can neutralize, maybe using electromagnetic type of activities, or we could use lasers that could take out the technology. I'm not causing debris. I'm protecting myself, and it's potentially there's more players that can get involved in that type of capability too. So I think that's going to be the trend. I always bring up an analogy in my books with the maritime domain, just like in the seas, oceans of the world, where opposing navies, they didn't want to really do harbor mining or open water mines because they're indiscriminate obstacles. So creating debris through a kinetic kill vehicle is an indiscriminate obstacle.
I want to now come to a little bit on how this competition also involved India. We're talking about America and China, and of course, Russia, you mentioned. Talk to me about how you see India's growing potency in this domain.
It's phenomenal, the interest of India. I would say historically, India has always used space as an enabler for its other operations, whether it's India's Navy using satellite communications, Earth observation to protect its borders, and the like. We mentioned the direct descent ASAT testing, which was saying, hey, India's arrived on the world stage now too. We have capabilities. I think all countries need now realize we probably want to minimize the debris generation. But I think we'll see a growing use of it. I'm excited about India's human space program, that getting underway. I think we're really close there. I would, in the West, we like to bin great powers and medium powers. Yeah. India's in this wonderful category where it's on the cusp of being a great space power. The last thing being its crewed or human spaceflight capability. But on the security side, I would say for your own internal security and for your border security, space is a great enabler just to monitor. And let's look at the role of AI, predictive analytics, being able to predict when potential adversaries would be attacking your border or wherever they are.
I need to ask you, as all of this develops, what kind of ethical or rules, framework is being governed against on this entire domain. It seems to me that whenever I read something about space warfare, very few people are talking about how to sort of put it in a framework. And in that sense, it seems a bit like the wild, wild west, which, of course, I don't think anybody sensible wants. So talk to me a little bit about how the, sort of guardrails of ethical behavior in this domain are evolving. Who are the people working on this, and how do you see this pan out?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. There is this idea that it is the Wild West, especially when we look at low Earth orbit and thousands of satellites. It's much more, it's well governed. It's more governed than a lot of people understand. So the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which pretty much all space powers have signed, acknowledged the peaceful uses of outer space. No claims of sovereignty. We have the International Telecommunications Union, which governs the geostationary slots for satellites in that orbital regime. And we also have spectrum management through the International Telecommunications Union, where countries are divvied up the spectrum back to that electromagnetic spectrum. My radio frequencies, we need to make sure we don't deconflict. But what also the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 does, it mentions the UN treaty too. So the inherent right of self-defense applies to all countries. And this opens up international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. So there's proportionality, there'll be military necessity, there'll be, what is a use of force, what is an armed attack, the same things that we wrestle with in the other domains still applies to space. So it's much more governed because space is the newest domain, maybe next to cyber, on how we consider warfare. There's still some open questions on historical precedent and how that'll get enforced, but it's much more, there's more governance in those considerations on the law of armed conflict than a lot of people realize.
There's been some conversation whether nuclear weapons can be, in a sense, deployed in this domain. For many of us who are resolutely against nuclear weapons, this, of course, really opens up a dramatic new vista, so to speak. Talk to me a little bit about how you think about this.
Yeah, so, back to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, it prohibits placing of nuclear weapons in space or on celestial bodies. It says nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. Open source reporting, New York Times and other outlets picked up that Russia was considering deploying a nuclear weapon in space. That would be a clear violation of the Outer Space Treaty, of which it signed. Okay, so there was a lot of international condemnation of this reporting. This would be a violation clearly, because Outer Space Treaty can be vague on certain things. It is not vague on that point about putting a nuclear weapon. A nuclear weapon detonation in space would be catastrophic for the space domain. U.S. in the early space age, it detonated a nuclear weapon under Starfish Prime test. We learned very quickly it's bad. It killed pretty much every satellite that was up there. So, the difference is fast forward 50 plus years, we have people up there. We have Chinese space station, they're taikonauts, and we have astronauts on the International Space Station. You detonate a nuke, you're killing people, and you're going to kill thousands and thousands of satellites, which people on Earth rely upon.
Well, we have seen, even though these norms that you're talking about seem very firm and resolute, we are, after all, at a time when we have seen the kind of war many people never expected, both in Ukraine, at least in the way it has panned out, of course, also in Gaza. The world system, as far as normative behavior is concerned, seems to be more fragile today than perhaps even 5 or 10 years ago. Since you mentioned Russia, do you think there could be any other violation of normative behavior in this?
Yeah, so this idea of norms, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I do write about norms a lot because it influences how we view conflict and peace in the space domain. The norms have to do with rights and obligations. Under the Outer Space Treaty, Russia has an obligation not to put a nuclear weapon in space. But when you bring up, current conflicts like Ukraine, we're seeing the emergence of new technology, drones, I think a lot of folks are surprised about how sophisticated drone warfare has got. So there is some ideas about, hey, there's uncharted territory, but I would say we have 50 plus years of experience in the space domain. So there's probably more things that we know or generally accept about norms or normative behavior. But when it comes to this idea of activities below the threshold of armed conflict, what's the role of electromagnetic warfare? What's the role of lasing? What's the role of commercial entities acting on behalf of governments? There's still some open questions. I always write this tagline that space is not special, it's just wonderfully different. But we wrestle with these questions in the other domains. Again, back to Ukraine, we saw Russia with a cyber attack against the US company Viasat, leading into its invasion of Ukraine. So what's the role of commercial? Is it okay for state entities to attack commercial companies? That's an open question.
Let me also ask you about private jets, right? I mean, this is something I recently heard from several people who work in this domain, that all of the things that you and I have been talking about even today are basically in the state-to-state domain. But there is also a private domain opening up. And quite like in nuclear weapons, where there has always been a real fear that something someday might fall in the hand of a non-state, and we don't know how they will behave, especially since space is a domain that's opening up for private exploration, so to speak. Do you fear that there could be, in a sense, people who might want to use, their private technologies and weaponize them in some way and sell it to the highest bidder?
Yeah, I do. So in this book, Irregular Warfare in Space, I write about the role of private military companies or mercenaries. So, this idea of force for hire, this idea goes back for thousands of years. If I don't have a military force, but I have money or I have the financial wherewithal, I can hire out some other force for security or to fight a conflict on my behalf. That's an enduring principle that across the ages in all domains. So yeah, I think it is a concern, maybe less so for countries like the US and India and others, but for other emerging powers, if they see a lucrative business case, and there's a lot of money out there in private military corporations, whether the Wagner Group that we saw in Ukraine too, there's a lot of financial means out there to have security services. So back to your idea, could you hire a bodyguard satellite that was commercial? Yeah, you could. Again, I think it would be a different country than the countries that we normally talk about.
Right.
Why not? And that opens up. Now back to the Outer Space Treaty, the launching state. So if I put a satellite in orbit, even if it's commercial, the country that launched it is registered as the launching state and is liable for its actions. So for SpaceX's Starlink, that's mostly the US. When India puts up a satellite, that would be the agency. So some countries may not care, the big ones will.
By the way, John, I must say, in all the interviews I've done, I've not had too many people who have shown us such wonderful props. And I really want to thank you for using this little props to demonstrate some basic things. That's great fun. I want to, as we come towards the end of this conversation, I have a few questions left for you. I want to focus a little bit about India, John, and how see India's work, even 2019 onwards, creation of its, different commands. How do you see the progress of India in this domain?
Yeah, I think it's only getting more and more profound. I would say that the US and a lot of Western countries are taking note of India's progress. A long and rich history of India's space program. It was like one of the original ones. So, I great launch capabilities, great satellite capabilities. We'll get that human crewed thing taken care of here soon. But, I think will be a player. I think it was a few years ago, India put out a licensing for like up to 30,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. So I think it's going to be a major player in addition to the U.S. and China's proliferated low Earth orbit constellations too. Wonderful capabilities. So I'm excited. And whenever, I have a book that came out about 10 years ago, and I have a whole section on India's because it is so noteworthy.
Let's talk a little bit about Russia because in many other domains we talk about Russian capability, but also the sort of weakening of that capability, the unclearness, so to speak, about what capabilities exist, how they're going to be deployed, what kind of delimitation, in a sense, has happened because of the Ukraine war. Talk to me a little bit about how you see Russia, considering Russia also is one of the original big players in this domain with great strength, at least at one point.
Yeah, wonderful question. So, we've been predicting the demise of Russia space program for many years, if not decades, right? So, they're down, but they're never out. So they were one of the first person to put a satellite in orbit, a first country to put a human in space, a deep, rich history in space exploration. Their economy, their workforce is struggling, especially on the technology point of view, aerospace sector, Roscosmos, but they're still capable. They still have great launch capability, very reliable. They have the core module and the International Space Station, so they have that going for them. And their cooperation with China, with the ILRS and other initiatives. So yeah, they're struggling, but they're still very capable. And I would say if you look at some of the open source reporting on what they have in space, whether it's their nesting dolls in space, their maneuvering capability, and the like, it is still significant and noteworthy.
So, to conclude this conversation, bringing the conversation back to America and China, one of the conversations that's happening around the world is on what domain is China really being able to effectively, in a sense, counter the US, at least on paper, because a lot of the Chinese capability, we don't know, how the testing is so, low and so on and so forth. One thing that often comes up is the Chinese naval capacities, which are growing exponentially and very swiftly. And there's a lot of alarm about that in parts of the world. In your opinion, where does China today stand vis-a-vis the United States in this critical future conflict domain of space?
Yeah, again, I would lean on the open source reporting of the think tank CSIS and Secure World Foundation. They do an annual threat assessment that really has a great laydown of all countries, Russia and China, and their capabilities. It is, like I was mentioning, some of the maneuvering capabilities. If you look at Chinese People's Liberation Army doctrine, sometimes it'll repeat back or parrot back U.S. military doctrine on space. So I think, but I'd say that probably China has its own vision. It has its 5-year plan, its white papers on exploration. It plans to go back to the moon. Go to the moon in 2030 and have a human presence, potentially having its own station, maybe permanently crewed. There's this idea of the lunar South Pole. We think there's water ice there. China, U.S., and other countries have expressed interest. Commercial companies will maybe help in that exploration as well. So I'd say overall, when it comes to space capabilities, there's some areas, maneuverability and rendezvous is good. Maybe I'm a little biased. I'd say the U.S. still has a lead in a lot of capabilities and the numbers, especially the innovation going on in the commercial sector. When we look at reusable launch, so I'll use a prop. So this is a SpaceX. This idea of a rocket first stage being recovered, that was unthinkable 15, 20 years ago. So now it's generally accepted this is doable. So yeah, I'd say it's noteworthy. The U.S. in most areas, maybe not all, still has a lead.
And my final question is, how soon or how far is the moment where we see actual weaponization and weapons clashing, in a sense, in any future conflict in the space domain. How far are we? How far are we from that point? We've also already, of course, seen the use of space-based technology for information and many other things. But how far are we? For this, weapons clashing moment? How far are we from that moment?
I'm going to answer your question, but maybe unsatisfying answer. So back to Karl von Clausewitz. He defines war as primordial violence. War isn't just about violence, but it's distinguishing characteristic. But when we consider, war, what is war? So that's two land armies that clash on the field of battle, lots of fatalities. But we have other forms of war. We have, I would say conventional war is regular warfare. But as again, back to this book, we've seen irregular warfare in space, and it has been going on. So irregular would be these coercive actions, these actions that are not friendly, they're malicious, nefarious, but it's below the threshold of the use of force or armed attack to elicit a country's overwhelming military response. So we have, again, jamming and lasing is going on daily in space. We have rendezvous and proximity operations going on between countries that are not cooperative. Maybe they're for inspection purposes. This is coercive and compellence. Again, nobody died. We have this saying that satellites don't have mothers. So if nobody dies, do we really care? But it's not peace. So maybe it's irregular warfare, or sometimes referred to as gray zone operations. We've been seeing that for some time. So I'll say we have seen that. When will we see, in a Clausewitzian sense of space warfare, primordial violence? I hope not ever, or for a very long time. That would require violence, potentially killing astronauts and taikonauts on space stations, destroying the space environment for everybody, destroying position navigation and timing, GPS, and maybe, taking out the whole low Earth orbit, which would be a big shame. And hopefully sane, rational people will avoid such a conflict.
That's a wonderful positive note with which to conclude this conversation. Klein, thanks very much for your time to talk to us about this very, very interesting and very potent new domain, space warfare. Thanks very much for your time, and thanks for joining me from DC, near DC today. Thank you.
Thank you.